The champagne glass slipped from my hand, crystal shattering against marble as the words on my husband's computer screen burned themselves into my memory. Transfer complete. Account closed. She'll never find it. I stood frozen in his study at 2:47 a.m., wearing the silk nightgown he'd bought me for our anniversary, staring at emails that revealed 23 years of marriage as an elaborate lie. The man sleeping peacefully upstairs had systematically stolen my inheritance, my mother's life savings, and the college fund I'd spent 15 years building for our daughter. My name is Rebecca, and until that moment, I believed I was living the American dream. Successful marriage to a respected real estate developer, beautiful home in Connecticut's Gold Coast, a daughter graduating from Yale in 3 months. I thought I knew my husband, thought I understood my life. I thought love meant trust, and trust meant safety. I was wrong about everything. For months, I'd been having what David called my episodes. Moments where I'd swear I'd left my keys in one place only to find them somewhere else. Conversations I remembered having that he claimed never happened. Documents I was certain I'd signed that mysteriously disappeared from my files. He'd been so patient, so concerned, suggesting I see Dr. Martinez about my increasing forgetfulness. Now I understood. There had been no episodes. There had been no forgetfulness. There had only been a husband systematically gaslighting his wife while he dismantled her financial security piece by piece. The email thread revealed conversations spanning 2 years, planning, calculating, discussing me like I was an obstacle to be managed rather than a wife to be cherished. Rebecca trusts everyone, one message read. She signs whatever I put in front of her. Always has. Sweet but naive. Perfect for what we need. My hands shook as I scrolled through transfer receipts. My grandmother's property in Vermont, sold without my knowledge 6 months ago. The savings account from my mother's estate, emptied gradually over 18 months. Through investment opportunities I'd supposedly approved. Even the bonds my father had left me, liquidated and moved to accounts I'd never seen, bearing signatures that looked like mine, but felt foreign under my fingertips when I traced them on the screen. But it wasn't just the money. It was the conversations about my mental state, how I'd been increasingly unstable and showing early signs of dementia, how he'd been protecting the family assets from my poor judgment and impulsive decisions. David had been building a case for months, creating a paper trail that painted me as mentally incompetent to justify why everything was suddenly in his name alone. I thought about the pills he'd been encouraging me to take for my anxiety, the new doctor he'd insisted I see, one who specialized in women's mental health issues, the way he'd been finishing my sentences lately, claiming I'd been confused about conversations I remembered perfectly, the concerned looks he'd exchanged with our friends when I'd correct him about details of our shared experiences. He wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my sanity, my credibility, my very sense of reality. And tomorrow morning, he would wake up expecting to find the same trusting wife who'd never questioned his word, never challenged his authority, never suspected that the man she'd built a life with was systematically destroying everything she held dear. Tomorrow was Saturday. David always played golf, with his partners on Saturdays, leaving at dawn and returning after dark. 23 years of these Saturday disappearances, and I'd never questioned where he really went, what he really did during those long hours away from home. Tomorrow, I would have 8 hours to document everything before I realized I'd discovered his true nature. 8 hours to understand the full scope of his betrayal. 8 hours to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be when the truth finally came to light. I wasn't the naive, trusting wife he thought he'd married anymore. That woman had died tonight in this study, surrounded by evidence of her husband's calculated cruelty. The woman who would wake up in the morning was someone else entirely, someone stronger, someone smarter, someone who understood that the biggest betrayals come from those we trust most, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to become the storm that washes away everything built on lies. If you're enjoying my story of how I learned that resilience isn't about enduring pain, but about transforming it into power, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because what happened next would teach me that the most dangerous woman is one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. But first, I had to understand exactly how deep this deception went, and whether the man I'd shared a bed with for over 2 decades was planning something even worse than financial theft. Saturday morning arrived with the familiar sound of David's golf bag hitting the garage floor. 23 years of marriage, and I'd never questioned why he needed to leave so early, why these games lasted 12 hours, why he always returned home exhausted, but never smelling like the golf course. Now I knew different. After his Mercedes disappeared down our driveway, I returned to his study with my laptop and a pot of coffee. What I discovered in the next 2 hours shattered every assumption I'd held about the man I'd called my husband, my partner, my best friend. The computer files revealed a methodical campaign of financial abuse spanning not just months, but years. David hadn't simply stolen from me impulsively. He'd planned this with the precision of an architect designing a building, except what he'd been constructing was my complete financial dependence and social isolation. I found folders labeled with code names that made my blood run cold. Project Clean Slate contained documents outlining how to legally declare me mentally incompetent. Phase 2 held correspondence with lawyers about conservatorship laws in Connecticut. Rebecca Management was filled with notes about my daily routines, my friendships, my emotional patterns, as if I were a subject being studied rather than a wife being loved. Each folder contained months of meticulous planning, screenshots of my social media posts with annotations about my erratic behavior, records of my phone calls, somehow obtained and analyzed, for signs of confusion or emotional instability. Even photographs of me taken without my knowledge, with notes about my appearance, my weight, my supposed deterioration. But the most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Insurance Scenarios. Life insurance policies I'd never seen before, with David as the sole beneficiary. Policies worth $2.3 million that I'd allegedly signed during what the timestamp showed were my doctor appointments with Dr. Martinez. The same appointments where David claimed I'd been showing signs of early dementia. My hands trembled as I opened another file. Medication protocol. David had been researching drugs that could cause confusion, memory loss, and disorientation. Substances that could be administered gradually without detection. The same symptoms Dr. Martinez had been documenting during our sessions. I realized then that David hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd been erasing me, systematically removing every trace of my financial independence, my credibility, my very existence as an autonomous person. And the end goal wasn't just to take everything I owned. It was to ensure I wouldn't be around to object. I thought about the wine he'd been bringing me each evening, always insisting I drink it to help me relax. The vitamins he'd started giving me 6 months ago, claiming they were for my mental clarity. The way I'd been feeling increasingly foggy, increasingly uncertain about my own memories. My phone buzzed with a text from him. Golf running long today. Don't wait up. Love you. The casual cruelty of that love you after what I'd discovered made my stomach turn. How long had he been saying those words while planning my destruction? How many mornings had he kissed me goodbye while carrying out another phase of his plan to erase me? I pulled up our joint banking app with shaking fingers. 3 accounts that had contained over $400,000 last month now showed balances under $1,000. Money I'd assumed was safely invested for our retirement had simply vanished, along with the woman who'd trusted the man managing it. But David had made one crucial mistake. In all his meticulous planning, he'd underestimated something fundamental about the woman he'd married. I wasn't the naive, trusting fool he'd convinced himself I was. I was the daughter of a mother who'd survived the Depression by hiding money in coffee cans and teaching her daughter to always have an escape plan. I was the woman who'd built a successful career in social work before marriage, who'd helped hundreds of women recognize the signs of abuse and manipulation. I was someone who understood systems, who knew how to document evidence, who had friends in legal services and victim advocacy. More importantly, I was someone who'd spent 15 years building relationships with Connecticut's most powerful women through charity work, volunteer organizations, and community boards. Women who'd faced their own battles and won. Women who understood that sometimes the greatest strength comes from appearing weak while planning your victory in silence. David had spent months making me doubt my own memory, my own judgment, my own reality. But sitting in his study, surrounded by evidence of his systematic betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Absolute clarity. The fog that had been clouding my thoughts for months suddenly lifted, and I understood it had never been natural at all. I opened a new browser window and created an email account he didn't know about. Then I began forwarding every document, every email, every piece of evidence to myself. If David wanted to play psychological warfare, he was about to discover he'd chosen the wrong opponent. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of his deception. I opened his calendar application and cross-referenced his golf appointments with his credit card statements. What I found made my stomach drop. While he'd been telling me he was improving his golf game, David had been meeting with lawyers, private investigators, and medical professionals who specialized in mental competency evaluations. He'd also been meeting with someone named L. Rodriguez every Tuesday for the past 8 months. The restaurant receipts showed expensive dinners, wine that cost more than most people's monthly groceries, and hotel charges that made the true nature of these meetings crystal clear. My phone rang. Emily, my daughter, calling from her dorm at Chiao, Yale. For a moment, I considered not answering. How do you tell your child that her father isn't who she thinks he is? How do you protect her from the knowledge that the man who'd walked her to her first day of school was capable of planning your destruction? But then I remembered the insurance, policies, the conservatorship plans, the careful documentation of my supposed mental decline. This wasn't just about me anymore. Emily was his daughter too, and if he was willing to plan my disappearance for financial gain, what would he do to her if she ever stood between him and what he wanted? I answered the call, keeping my voice steady. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, I've been thinking about graduation. I want to do something special for you and Dad. Maybe a family trip? You've both worked so hard for this moment. Emily's innocent excitement cut through me like a blade. She had no idea that her college education had been funded by stolen money, that her trust fund had been emptied, that the father she adored had been systematically destroying the mother who'd given up her career to raise her. That sounds wonderful, honey. We'll talk about it soon. After hanging up, I sat in the silence of David's study, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, and made a decision that would change everything. He'd spent months trying to convince the world that I was losing my mind, that I couldn't be trusted with money, that I needed to be managed and controlled. I thought about all the women I'd counseled over the years, women who'd sat in my office and told me about husbands who made them feel crazy, who moved their belongings and denied it, who told them they were imagining things. I'd given them strategies, resources, hope. Now I would need to give myself the same gifts. Tomorrow I would show him exactly how sharp my mind still was, and just how dangerous a woman becomes when she has nothing left to lose except the people she loves. But first, I needed to understand something crucial. Was I the only victim, or had David done this before? Because if the man I'd married was capable of this level of calculated cruelty, I doubted I was his first target. The answer to my question came faster than I expected. While David played his pretend golf game, I drove to the one place I knew would have records he couldn't control: the courthouse in downtown Hartford. Public records. Don't lie. They can't be gaslit or manipulated or convinced they're remembering things wrong. And what I found in those dusty filing cabinets made me understand that David hadn't just done this before. He'd perfected it. Margaret Chen, married to David from 1995 to 1997. Divorced on grounds of mental incompetency. Jennifer Walsh, married from 1998 to 2001. Same grounds. Both women had apparently suffered sudden mental decline that necessitated conservatorships. Both had lost everything in their divorces due to their inability to manage financial affairs. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot, holding photocopies of their divorce documents, and felt something cold settle in my chest. I wasn't David's third wife. I was his third victim. But I was also the one who'd lasted the longest, which meant I was either his most successful con, or I possessed something that others hadn't. Sitting there with 23 years of marriage spread out before me like evidence in a criminal case, I realized what that something was: patience. David had been meticulous with Margaret and Jennifer, but he'd been rushed. 2 years, 3 years, then divorce and disappearance. With me, he'd taken his time, built a life, had a child, created a reputation in the community that made his word unquestionable and mine suspect. But that same patience had given me something he hadn't anticipated: deep roots in this community. 23 years of volunteer work, charity boards, school committees, 23 years of building relationships with Connecticut's most influential women. Women who knew me, trusted me, and would recognize gaslighting when they saw it. I pulled out my phone and made the first call that would change everything. Elizabeth? It's Rebecca Matthews. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has David ever suggested that I've been different lately? Confused? Forgetful? Elizabeth Morrison had been my co-chair on the hospital fundraising committee for 8 years. Her pause told me everything I needed to know. Rebecca, honey, he mentioned at the country club last month that you'd been struggling with some memory issues. He seemed so concerned. We all were. What exactly did he say? That you'd been repeating conversations, forgetting appointments. He was worried about early onset dementia. Said you were too proud to admit there was a problem. I closed my eyes, feeling the web of lies David had woven around me. Elizabeth, I need you to remember this conversation we're having right now. I need you to remember that my voice is clear, my thoughts are organized, and I'm asking you to pay attention to what happens next. After hanging up, I made 6 more calls to women in my social circle. Same story. David had been laying groundwork for months, expressing concern about my mental state, preparing them to witness my decline with sympathy rather than suspicion. But David had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed these women would simply accept his version of events. He didn't understand that women who'd built successful businesses, raised families, and survived their own challenges weren't easily fooled by a man's tears and concerned expressions. I drove home with a plan, forming in my mind. David would return from his fake golf game expecting to find the same confused, malleable wife he'd left that morning. Instead, he'd find a woman who'd spent the day documenting his crimes and preparing for war. The house felt different when I walked through the front door. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was seeing it with new eyes. The framed photos of our happy family were lies. The expensive furniture was bought with stolen money. Even the flowers in my garden seemed tainted by the knowledge that they'd been watered with my tears while David plotted my destruction. I went to my bedroom and pulled out a suitcase, not to pack, but to hide evidence. 23 years of marriage had taught me where David never looked. My shoeboxes, my jewelry case, the bottom drawer of my vanity table. Places he considered women's territory and, therefore, irrelevant. That's where I hid the printed emails, the bank statements, the insurance policies, the courthouse records. Evidence that would prove David's systematic campaign of psychological and financial abuse. Evidence that would show I wasn't the first victim, and without intervention, I wouldn't be the last. My phone buzzed with another text from David. Stopping for drinks with the guys. See you around 9. Hope you had a restful day. Restful. As if I'd spent the day napping instead of uncovering his criminal conspiracy. As if I were the fragile, confused woman he'd convinced. Everyone I was becoming. I looked at myself in the bedroom mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. Not because I'd changed physically, but because I was finally seeing clearly. The woman staring back at me wasn't David's victim anymore. She was his adversary. And she was about to remind him that the most dangerous opponent is one who's been underestimated for far too long. I had 4 hours before David returned home. 4 hours to make the calls that would either save my life or confirm his suspicions that I was becoming a threat he needed to eliminate. The first call was to someone David didn't know existed in my life. Detective Maria Santos, my college roommate's daughter, who worked financial crimes for the Connecticut State Police. The second call would be to Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist who specialized in psychological abuse cases and who could conduct an independent mental evaluation. The third call was the most important one of all. But before I made it, I needed to prepare for the possibility that David's plan was further along than I'd realized. Because if he was willing to drug me into compliance, if he was planning to have me declared incompetent, if he'd already put those insurance policies in place, then tonight might be my last chance to fight back. And I intended to make it count. Detective Maria Santos answered on the second ring. Rebecca? My God, it's been years. How are you? I'm calling because I need help, and I think you're the only person who can give it to me. The words came out steadier than I felt. Maria, I believe my husband has been systematically drugging me, stealing my money, and planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. Silence. Then, Are you safe right now? He thinks I'm home taking a nap. He's been giving me pills that make me foggy, wine that makes me confused. But I stopped taking everything yesterday, and my head is clearer than it's been in months. I need you to listen carefully. Don't confront him. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Can you document evidence without him knowing? I already have. Bank records, emails, insurance policies I never signed. Maria, he's done this before. 2 other wives, same pattern. I heard her typing in the background. Okay, I'm opening a file. This is now an official investigation. But Rebecca, if he's escalating to physical harm, we need to move fast. After hanging up with Maria, I called Dr. Patricia Williams. Within an hour, she'd agreed to conduct an emergency mental evaluation that afternoon, one that would scientifically prove my competency before David could arrange his own biased assessment. The evaluation took place in Dr. Williams's office while David believed I was grocery shopping. Cognitive tests, memory assessments, psychological screenings, all documented, all time-stamped, all proving that my mind was not only intact, but functioning at exceptionally high levels. Rebecca, Dr. Williams said as we finished, your results show no signs of cognitive decline, confusion, or memory loss. In fact, your scores indicate above-average mental acuity for someone your age. If someone has been telling you otherwise, they've been lying. Having that validation in writing felt like being handed back my sanity. David had tried to steal my reality, but now I had scientific proof that my reality was the correct one. But the most important call I made that afternoon was to someone David had never heard me mention. Catherine Pierce, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases. Catherine had built her reputation destroying men who thought they could hide money from their wives. I can be at your house tomorrow morning, Catherine said after I explained the situation. Bring me everything you found, and I'll find everything you haven't. As the afternoon sun slanted, through my kitchen windows, I prepared for David's return. I arranged the pills he'd been giving me in their usual spot, but I'd replaced the contents with vitamins. I chilled the wine he always insisted I drink, but I'd switched it with identical bottles that contained nothing but grape juice and food coloring. Tonight, for the first time in months, I would be completely clear-headed while David believed I was becoming more compliant. Tonight, I would watch him try to manipulate me while I documented every lie, every calculated cruelty, every moment of psychological abuse. I set my phone to record and slipped it into my pocket. Whatever David said tonight would become evidence in Maria's investigation. At exactly 9:15, I heard his key in the door. The same sound I'd welcomed for 23 years now filled me with a cold determination I'd never experienced before. Rebecca? I'm home, he called, his voice carrying that false warmth I now recognized as performance. In the kitchen, I replied, making my voice sound slightly foggy, slightly uncertain. The voice of the woman he thought he'd created through months of psychological manipulation. David appeared in the doorway, still wearing his golf clothes, but carrying shopping bags that definitely weren't from the pro shop. His smile was practiced, affectionate, the smile of a devoted husband returning home to his beloved wife. How was your day, sweetheart? You look tired. I knew that tired was code for confused and malleable, the state he'd been engineering for months. I've been having those memory problems again, I said, letting my voice waver slightly. I couldn't remember if I'd locked the front door this morning, or if I'd taken my pills. His eyes lit up with interest, the way a predator's eyes focus when prey shows weakness. Oh, honey, that's concerning. Maybe we should call Dr. Martinez tomorrow, see if he wants to adjust your medication. I watched him pull a small bottle from his pocket, the same vitamins he'd been crushing into my food for months. Except now I knew they weren't vitamins at all. Actually, David continued, I picked up something that might help. He pulled a brochure from one of his shopping bags. Peaceful Meadows. It's a residential facility that specializes in early-stage memory care. I thought we could visit this weekend, just to explore our options. The facility where he planned to warehouse me while he liquidated the rest of my assets. The place where he could visit his poor, confused wife while playing the devoted husband to everyone else. But here's what David didn't understand about the woman he'd underestimated for 23 years. I'd spent decades helping other women escape situations exactly like this. I knew every manipulation tactic, every legal loophole, every way an abusive man tries to control his victim. And I knew something else he'd forgotten. The most dangerous woman in the world is one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. If you're following this story because you recognize the signs I missed for too long, remember that knowledge is power. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from appearing weak while you plan your victory in silence. Don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will show you exactly how powerful a woman becomes when she stops believing the lies and starts trusting her own truth. David was about to learn that the confused, helpless wife he thought he'd created was actually the architect of his own destruction. And tomorrow morning, when Catherine Pierce arrived to forensically examine our finances, his carefully constructed house of lies would begin to crumble. But tonight, I would give him exactly the performance he expected while I gathered the final pieces of evidence that would bury him. The performance I gave David that night would have earned me an Academy Award. I took the fake pills with trembling hands, sipped the harmless wine with confused gratitude, and listened to his concerned suggestions about getting more help with wide, trusting eyes. But what David didn't know was that every word was being recorded. Every lie documented, every moment of his psychological manipulation, captured for Detective Santos and the prosecutors, who would soon be very interested in his activities. When he suggested I sign some routine paperwork to protect our assets, I watched him produce documents that would have transferred the deed to our house into his name alone. Documents that cited my declining mental capacity as justification. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "These papers will ensure that if something happens to your memory, our family is protected." I signed them with a shaking hand, letting him believe he'd won. What David didn't realize was that I'd already had an attorney prepare counter documents that would void anything I signed under duress or while being medicated without my knowledge. Tuesday morning. Arrived with Catherine Pierce's unmarked van in my driveway. While David attended what he believed was a crucial business meeting, Catherine and her team of forensic specialists dismantled his financial empire piece by piece. What they found exceeded even my worst suspicions. David hadn't just stolen from me. He'd been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme through his real estate development company, using his marriage to me as legitimacy. My reputation in the community, my charity work, my social connections had all been tools in his criminal enterprise. "Rebecca," Catherine said, her voice grim as she showed me spreadsheets that traced money through dozens of shell companies. "He's stolen approximately $12 million. Not just from you, but from elderly clients who trusted him with their retirement savings." Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, the widow who'd hired David to sell her late husband's commercial properties. She'd trusted him with $2.3 million in proceeds. He'd given her a check for $800,000 and kept the rest, convincing her that real estate values had plummeted. Mr. James Walsh, a retired teacher who'd invested his pension with David's company. David had told him the market crashed and his investments were worthless. Meanwhile, that money had been funding David's lavish lifestyle and his plan to disappear with me safely committed to a mental facility. But Catherine's most shocking discovery was hidden in David's personal safe. 3 death certificates. Margaret Chen, his first wife, hadn't divorced him due to mental incompetency. She'd died in a car accident 6 months after their marriage. Jennifer Walsh, his second wife, had died from an apparent drug overdose just as she was threatening to expose his financial crimes. I stared at those certificates with ice in my veins. David wasn't just a financial predator. He was a serial killer who used marriage as his hunting method. "We need to call Detective Santos immediately," Catherine said. "This isn't just fraud anymore. This is murder." But David's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence or overlooking evidence. His biggest mistake was that he'd never bothered to research my background thoroughly enough to discover that my late father had been Connecticut State Police, and that I'd grown up understanding exactly how criminals get caught. I'd spent the past week not just gathering evidence, but building an unbreakable case. Every document was professionally copied and stored in multiple locations. Every conversation was recorded and backed up to secure servers. Every financial transaction was traced and verified by independent sources. When Detective Santos arrived with a warrant Wednesday afternoon, David walked into a trap 23 years in the making. He found me in the kitchen, apparently taking my afternoon pills, seemingly confused and compliant. What he couldn't see was the team of investigators already positioned throughout our house, the recording equipment capturing every word, the federal agents waiting in unmarked cars outside. "Rebecca, sweetheart, we need to talk about your condition," David began, his voice carrying that practiced concern I now recognized as predatory. "Dr. Martinez thinks it's time to consider residential care." "I trust your judgment," I replied, my voice soft and uncertain, the voice of a woman who'd been systematically broken down and convinced of her own incompetence. "Good. I've arranged for you to visit Peaceful Meadows tomorrow. It's just temporary until we can stabilize your medication." David pulled out a new set of papers, these ones transferring power of attorney and giving him complete control over all medical decisions. The final step in his plan to erase me completely. But as I reached for the pen with a trembling hand, Detective Santos stepped into the kitchen, with her badge raised. "David Matthews, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and suspected murder." The transformation in David's face was instantaneous and terrifying. The concerned husband vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly without remorse. But what shocked me most wasn't his lack of denial or surprise. It was his immediate rage directed entirely at me. "You manipulative bitch," he snarled. All pretense dropped. "You've been planning this. You've been lying to me." And in that moment, I stood up straight, looked him in the eye, and let him see the woman I'd always been beneath the performance he'd demanded. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I have been lying to you, just like you've been lying to Margaret Chen and Jennifer Walsh and every elderly person who trusted you with their life savings." His face went white as he realized I knew about the deaths, about the pattern, about everything. "The difference between us, David, is that my lies were designed to protect innocent people. Yours were designed to destroy them." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, David looked at me with something approaching respect. For the first time in our 23-year marriage. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've suspected for months. I've known for certain for exactly 1 week. But I've been preparing for this moment my entire life. Because here's what David never understood about the woman he'd married. I wasn't the naive social worker he'd convinced himself he was manipulating. I was my father's daughter, trained from childhood to recognize predators and protect their victims. And sometimes the most effective way to catch a monster is to let him believe he's already won. 6 months later, I stood in a courtroom as David was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and 2 counts of murder in the first degree. The evidence Catherine and I had gathered was so overwhelming that his attorney advised him to accept a plea deal rather than face a trial that would have resulted in life imprisonment. But the most powerful moment wasn't the judge's sentencing. It was when 17 elderly victims stood up to address the court, describing how David had stolen their retirement savings, their children's inheritance, their sense of security and their golden years. Men and women in their 70s and 80s, finding their voices to speak truth about the man who'd preyed on their trust. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, the widow whose husband's commercial property David had sold for millions while giving her pennies, looked directly at him as she spoke. "You didn't just steal my money, Mr. Matthews. You stole my dignity, my independence, my ability to live my final years with grace. But standing here today, I'm taking all of that back." When it was my turn to speak, I looked at David and saw not the charismatic man I'd married, but exactly what he'd always been, a predator who used charm and manipulation to destroy vulnerable people. David Matthews spent 23 years convincing me I was losing my mind, I told the court. He drugged me, stole from me, and planned to have me committed so he could inherit my assets. But his greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence. It was underestimating my capacity to transform pain into purpose. After the sentencing, Emily and I drove home together in silence. My daughter had struggled with the revelation of who her father really was, but she'd also watched her mother emerge, from decades of manipulation stronger and clearer than ever before. "Mom," she said as we pulled into our driveway, "I need to tell you something. Dad tried to turn me against you months ago. He told me you were getting sick, that you might say things that weren't true. He made me promise to call him if you started acting strange." I felt a familiar chill. David had been trying to isolate me even from my own daughter, preparing her to dismiss anything I might say if I discovered his crimes. But you know what? Emily continued. Even when you were supposedly confused, you were still the smartest, most intuitive person I knew. You taught me to trust women's instincts, to question men who try to control our narratives. Without realizing it, you'd already given me the tools to see through his manipulation. That conversation with Emily taught me something profound. Even while David was trying to destroy my credibility, I was unconsciously modeling for my daughter what real strength looked like. Not loud defiance, but quiet preparation. Not dramatic confrontation, but methodical documentation. Not emotional retaliation, but strategic justice. The house felt different after David's arrest. Not just because he wasn't there, but because I was finally free to be myself within its walls. I threw away the pills he'd been giving me, poured out the wine he'd insisted I drink, and for the first time in years, experienced what it felt like to live in my own mind without chemical interference. I also discovered that the financial recovery was more extensive than I'd imagined. Catherine's forensic work had uncovered assets David had hidden in offshore accounts, property investments he'd made with stolen money, and insurance policies that had never been legally valid. After restitution to his victims, I was left with enough money to rebuild my life however I chose. But money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the woman I'd become through the process of saving myself. I established the Peterson Foundation, named after Eleanor and funded by my recovered assets. Our mission was simple: provide legal, financial, and psychological support to women over 50 who suspected they were being financially abused by intimate partners. Within a year, we'd helped 43 women escape situations similar to mine. The Foundation's approach was based on everything I'd learned: document everything, trust your instincts, build a support network, and never confront your abuser until you have an unbreakable case. We taught women how to recognize gaslighting, how to secretly gather evidence, how to protect themselves while appearing compliant. But perhaps the most important work we did was simply believing women when they said something felt wrong. So many of our clients had been told by family, friends, even doctors that they were imagining problems, becoming paranoid, or losing their mental faculties. We provided the validation that their reality was real, their suspicions were justified, and their intelligence was intact. Maria Santos, who'd become a close friend through the investigation, joined our board of directors. "Rebecca," she told me after our first annual fundraiser, "you've created something revolutionary. You're not just helping individual women escape abuse. You're changing how society recognizes and responds to financial manipulation of older women." The work was deeply satisfying, but it was also deeply personal. Every woman we helped reminded me of the person I'd been just months earlier: intelligent, capable, successful, yet somehow convinced by someone else that she was none of those things. Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd conducted my mental evaluation, became our staff psychologist. She often said that the most insidious form of abuse wasn't physical violence, but psychological manipulation that made victims doubt their own perceptions. When someone systematically undermines your reality, she explained to our support groups, they're committing a form of psychological murder. They're trying to kill the person you know yourself to be. Emily graduated from Yale summa cum laude and surprised me by choosing to study elder law, specifically focusing on financial abuse prevention. "You showed me that justice isn't always dramatic," she told me at her graduation dinner. "Sometimes it's just methodical, patient, and unstoppable." 2 years after David's sentencing, I received a letter that changed my perspective on everything I'd endured. It was from Margaret Chen's sister, who'd tracked me down after reading news coverage of David's trial. "My sister Margaret didn't die in a car accident," the letter began. "She was murdered, just like Jennifer Walsh. But her death was ruled accidental because David had convinced everyone she was mentally unstable. Reading about your case gave us hope that maybe Margaret's death could finally be investigated properly." That letter led to the reopening of Margaret's case. David was eventually charged with 2 additional counts of murder, though he would never leave prison regardless. But more importantly, it brought closure to 2 families who'd been told their suspicions about their loved ones' deaths were unfounded. Standing in my living room today, looking at photos from the Peterson Foundation's recent award ceremony, I understand something about survival that I wish I'd known 23 years ago. The strongest women aren't those who never face adversity. They're those who transform their pain into purpose, their victimization into victory, their silence into powerful voices that protect others. David Matthews tried to convince me I was losing my mind, but what I actually lost was my willingness to accept less than I deserved. He tried to steal my reality, but what he actually stole was my tolerance for lies and manipulation. He tried to break me, but what he actually broke was my habit of making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurity. My voice became my weapon. My story became my revolution. Not because I sought revenge, but because I chose transformation. If my story resonates with you, if you recognize the signs I ignored for too long, remember this. Your instincts are valid. Your intelligence is intact, and your strength is greater than anyone who tries to diminish it realizes. Trust yourself. Document everything. Build your network. And never, ever accept the narrative that you're too confused, too emotional, or too old to recognize what's happening to you. Because the most dangerous woman in the world is one who has learned to trust herself completely. And if you're reading this, wondering if your own situation feels familiar, know that you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're stronger than you know. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because stories like ours need to be told. Not to frighten, but to empower. Not to create victims, but to create survivors who refuse to be anyone's fool ever again. The woman who stood confused in David's study that night at 2:47 a.m. was my former self. The woman telling you this story is who I became when I stopped accepting someone else's version of my reality and started trusting my own truth. And that transformation changed everything.